All right, Jip, chapter 9. You remember that in chapter 8, Jip and Lucy went to school. And so at the end of the day, um, teacher began reading them the story Oliver Twist about the boy who was um, born in a workhouse. His mother died, so another poor motherless child. Um, and Jip is just entranced by the story. So chapter 9 is called The Celebration. And it starts as Lucy and Jip are walking home from school. As soon as they got to the pasture that belonged to the town farm, Jip set off on a fast trot. Put! He had nearly forgotten him in all the excitement of the school day. The Lymans would have left him locked in the cage. No one dared let him out except Jip. Poor man, cooped up all day like a rabbit in a hutch. Jip grabbed the key from the cupboard and raced to unlock the padlock. By this time, Lucy had caught up with him, and the two of them led Put out into the backyard. It was past sundown, but the old man must have a chance to stretch his cramped body. Dark is dark is dark. Jip's blood ran cold. What you say, Put? Dark is dark. Come on, Put, Jip crooned. Time to go to bed. Like you say, it's mighty dark. What if it was too late? What if he paid no heed? The dark days of November were upon them, and Put always fared worse in the dark. He took the old man's hand and turned him toward the kitchen door. Come on now, that's it. Dark is. Yeah, me too. I don't care much for the dark neither. Now come along, eh? You can snuggle up under your quilt, and I'll fetch you something warm for your belly. It'll make you feel better. Put stood still as a stump. Jip struggled against a rise of panic in his chest. What if the old man refused to go in? What then? Here, he said, fighting to expel the anxiety from his voice. Give me your right hand. Lucy will take your left. Good girl, she took the big hand quickly, calm as though she were taking Toddy for a stroll in the fields. Now move your feet. That's it. Not far to go. Here, up the stoop, onto the porch. Good. Dark is. Easy, easy there. Jip pulled the door open with his free hand, and somehow, miraculously, he and Lucy got Put into the kitchen, down the hall, and safely into the cage. Jip was sweating something fierce, and his hands shook like palsy as he clapped the shackle onto the padlock. At the click, Put's head jerked up, but he didn't cry out. Lucy, Jip whispered, his eyes fixed on his friend's. Could you get him something warm? Milk, I think, not too hot. I'd best stay with Put. She nodded and ran off toward the kitchen. When she brought the steaming mug, Jip took a sip to make sure of the temperature, and then handed it through the little trap door to Jip. Here, he said, Lucy's brought you some nice warm milk. Ain't that nice? Put turned slowly toward him. Oh, mercy. His eyes were like a crazed horse's. Jip backed up to spite himself as the mug was snatched from his grasp and crashed against the slats of the cage, splashing white milk and shards of brown crockery in every direction. Put! Lucy screamed. Stop that! Jip wanted to yell too, but he knew it wouldn't help. Put was gone from them, at least for a while. At first, supper forgotten, the frightened residents with the Lymans among them huddled in the cold hallway outside the cage room. Then Toddy began to cry, and Mrs. Wilkins took charge, herding the lot of them toward the kitchen table. Jip never went to eat, nor did he hear when the others climbed the stairs to bed. The men were all asleep when he stole up to get his quilt from his cot and returned to his lonely vigil. A vigil was a watch. The lunatic raged all night long, cutting himself on fragments of the shattered mug. Jip fetched a rake and stuck it between the slats, trying to clear the pieces out of the cage, but Put grabbed the handle and snapped it in two across his knee. Then he stuck a jagged, splintered end through the slats, wielding it like an ugly weapon. Oh, Put, Jip sobbed silently, moving out of range of the broken rake handle and Put's fury. Oh, Put, don't leave me now. I need you so bad. How can I do my schooling without you? Jip slept hardly at all that night, wrapped in his quilt in the far corner of the cage room, listening to the unearthly sounds that filled the darkness like some demon chant. He had no hope of going to school the next morning, as exhausted as he was. Put was finally asleep, but still tossing and crying out. Jip had done no chores, no schoolwork, but Mrs. Wilkins was adamant. Just do the milking. That cow won't have none of me. I'll do the rest of your chores. Lucy won't go without you, seems. You got to come, Lucy whispered in his ear. You know, we got to find out what happens. He swiped a wet rag across his burning eyes and started out for school. As soon as he put his bottom on the back bench, his head fell down on the long desk in front, and he was dead asleep. Willie Brackett thumped the back of his head. Teacher, Willie cried, the gypsy's snoring like an old dog. Leave him alone, Willie, teacher said quietly. Jip slept through the morning. He was dimly aware that the others had gone out for lunch, but when they returned, he never lifted his head. This, despite Addison, Warner, and Willie Brackett climbing noisily and clumsily over his bent back. Somehow, though, when teacher told everyone to put away their books and slates, he came suddenly wide awake, straining forward eagerly for the next chapter of Oliver's adventures. Put's spell lasted until that Friday. Jip didn't try to give him another piece of crockery, but fed him bread and cheese and served him water in a wooden cup. Sometimes Put snatched the food as though he were starving. At other times he seemed not to know Jip was there, or care. His hair was wild and matted. There was food and spittle caught in his beard. The once sweet-smelling mattress reeked of urine. It grieved Jip to see him so, and though he had no hope that anything would help, he crooned comforting words to counter the crazed ravings of the lunatic. Sometimes he and Lucy would sing in the cage room. All is well, they'd sing, though everything was far from well. Lucy, like a smaller version of teacher, reviewed Jip on his letters and simple times tables, following him to the barn to hear him recite. But once she realized he knew the alphabet in order, she wasn't sure what to do next. Your name, I suppose, though it ain't much of a name. All I got, he said, then added almost to himself, for now. He knew how to write his name, but for Lucy's sake he pretended ignorance, so he pretended that he didn't know, to make her feel like she was teaching him. She made him practice J-I-P on the borrowed slate, and then W-E-S-T, since that was the name as teacher had spelled it out. You're lucky, she said. Lucy Wilkins is much harder to spell. Yeah, he said, least mine's short, noting the difference between his 7 letters and Lucy's 11. So they decided that first he would master everyone's name, then the Lord's Prayer, since it was posted to memorize and would be easy to follow along if you already knew the words it was made up of. Jip sighed. It'll be a year of Christmases before I can read a story like teacher does. When Putt gets better, it'll be easier, Lucy said. Teacher helped. When I'm working with the little ones, you listen sharp. You don't have to be sitting down front to hear. So, by sheer stubborn determination, Jip got through the first primer. The words tricked him. He'd think he knew the proper sound, and then the letters would cheat and take on some other sound or just sit there silent. It seemed unfair to Jip, as though words were unsteady, an undependable commodity. The little ones didn't question the fickleness of the language, but Jip did. You ought to be able to count on it more. It was ornery as some people. So what he's saying is that so many words in English don't sound the way they look. Like the letters in the word doesn't make the sound that you think it should. I'm trying to think of one right now that doesn't. Oh, goodness. Like was. The word was. That sounds like W-U-Z, right? But it's W-A-S. So, hard to count on the letters to always sound the way that you learn how they sound in kindergarten, right? Putt, dear old Putt, the Putt he loved, began after a couple of weeks to creep out from under the wild shell of madness that had clamped down on him. He was full of remorse when he came to himself and saw the state his cage and indeed his own self was in. The darkness seems to overpower me, Jip, he said. I wish I could know to fight it, but I lose to it every time. Jip wanted to say it was all right, that he understood. But it wasn't all right. And how could anyone understand the shadow that hung over his friend, ready to snatch him away with no warning hardly? Putt, bathed, dressed in clean clothes, his hair, beard, and nails neatly trimmed. Oh, this Putt was a proper schoolmaster. He insisted, however, that he teach from the cage, as he felt that during the dark days of winter he couldn't be entrusted with even the freedom of the cage room. The one exception was his bath, which soothed him body and mind, and gave Jip a chance to neaten up his hair and beard and nails. Jip also took apart the mattress, discarded the stinking straw, and scrubbed the cover. Mrs. Wilkins humphed and complained, but she was finally persuaded to stitch it up. "I need spectacles, Jip," Put explained, "if I'm to help you with your lessons. They took mine away before I come here." Spectacles or glasses. At first Jip was stumped. How was he to afford spectacles for Put? He knew Mr. Lyman would refuse. Then Lucy remembered. In the cupboard where Mrs. Lyman stored the clothes left by all the residents who had died, there was a little basket of spectacles as well. Jip had some conscience about stealing anything, but Lucy had no such scruples. She brought the whole basket down, and Put tried on every pair until he found one that suited him. "How do I look?" he asked. "It don't matter how you look," Lucy said. "Can you read now, Put?" Jip asked anxiously. "Not unless you tell me how handsome they make me." "Good earth and seas!" Lucy exclaimed. "Did you ever hear tell of such vanity?" But Jip laughed with delight to see his friend so restored to his true self. Toddy always wanted to come in, and though Mrs. Wilkins was obviously loath to let the little boy be close to the lunatic, and listened warily from the hallway, even she didn't have the heart to keep the child entirely away from the old man he loved so much. First Lucy, then Jip overheard Mrs. Lyman trying to persuade Mr. Lyman that the time had come to send Put to the asylum. The last episode had unnerved her, and life was always harder at the farm during the cold, bleak months. Mr. Lyman himself was seen scurrying down the cellar steps several times a day to fetch mugs of his ever more comforting cider. So remember, the cider that he put in the cellar is getting what's called hard cider, and hard cider is alcoholic. So basically he's going to get mugs of alcohol. But if light was in short supply, money was even shorter, and Mr. Lyman pointed out that Jip liked having a pet, and as long as they kept the lunatic padlocked in his cage, he could do little harm. "You don't call his shrieking and cursing the name of God harm, then, Mr. Lyman?" she asked. "Just shut your ears, Mrs. Lyman. No good Christian woman should allow herself to listen to such speech." "And just how is a good Christian woman supposed to shut her ears to such ungodly racket, Mr. Lyman? Will you tell me that?" But Mr. Lyman continued on his way to his bedroom, cider mug in hand. The matter was closed, at least for the present. Teacher was planning a celebration for the last day of school before Christmas. All the families were invited to come at 2:00 and bring refreshments to share. "Don't worry, you can be home in time for milking," she said. The students would provide the entertainment. Jip knew full well that Mrs. Lyman would not send poor farm food for rich folks to gobble down, and he resigned himself to missing the celebration. Lucy, however, had a sweet voice, and Teacher had asked her to sing a verse of one of the carols alone, so she was determined not only that she and Jip should stay for the party, but that her mother and Toddy should come as well. Mrs. Wilkin bullied Mrs. Lyman into letting her have enough flour and maple sugar to make a little cake. For the rest, they would content themselves with bread and cheese and apples from the cellar. When the day came, the snow was too deep for Toddy to walk, not being able as yet to manage snowshoes. But Mrs. Wilkins left the two little ones with Berthy and the other older ones and made her way across the fields to the schoolhouse. She had even managed to coax the loan of a lantern for the homeward trek. The cold weather had put an end to outdoor recess. The students spent the time making decorations for the little schoolhouse. Some kindly farmer gave them a tree and greens, and Teacher had brought candles for each of the 4 windows. By 2:00 on the afternoon of the celebration, the room twinkled and sparkled like a place of enchantment. The small yard began to fill with sleighs from the surrounding countryside. Teacher sent the older boys out to help with the horses. With noisy cheer, the red-faced farmers and their wives and tiny babes crowded the benches and overflowed into the narrow aisle. When Jip and the other boys came in, they found that Teacher had instructed the children to sit on the floor up front. The Brackets scowled, but one look from Teacher and they came down the aisle, elbowing one another and mumbling under their breath. She quietly sent Addison, Warner, and Willie to 3 separate spots on the floor, and when they had folded their long limbs and sat down, the program began. Deacon Avery's grandson, who was the best reader, read the Christmas story from the Gospel of Luke. Some of the older girls recited poems. The little ones struggled to sing on key the simple songs that teacher had taught them. Near the end of the hour, it was Lucy's turn. She sang in a firm, clear voice the message of the angels to the shepherds. Fear not, he said, for sudden dread had seized their troubled mind. Glad tidings of great joy I bring to you and all mankind. Jip was only in the chorus, for which he was glad. He didn't crave the chance to show off in front of strangers, but he could tell how Lucy loved it. She didn't seem to care that her dress was cut down from one of Bertie's. Her chin was up and proud. Her face shone as she sang. To you in David's town this day is born of David's line the Savior who is Christ the Lord, and this shall be the sign. The heavenly babe you there shall find to human view displayed, all meanly wrapped in swaddling bands and in a manger laid. Jip was hardly listening as he joined the others to sing the final stanza. As poor and meanly wrapped as Jesus was, he was descended from a king. It was not possible that a poor boy. Jip stole a look at Mrs. Wilkins' face. There was a softening in her usually hard features. Teacher looked different too. She had on a light blue dress, and above the lace-trimmed collar, her cheeks were flushed, her eyes bright. Jip caught her glancing at the back west corner and followed the glance to see what was putting the extra color in Teacher's face. There was a tall man sitting quietly there, looking only at Teacher, as though none of the rest of them had bothered to come into the room. Willie Brackett poked Jip in the ribs. Teacher's got a sweetheart, he whispered under the cover of applause. Jip's heart gave a little tweak. He shouldn't have been surprised, but still he'd thought of Teacher as belonging to the school, to them. The idea that someone else might try to lay claim to her attentions created a little pocket of sadness in him. But he couldn't argue with Willie. No matter what happened, who was reciting or singing, the man on the back row was seeing only Teacher. People were getting up. The children were laughing and seeking out their parents. The program was over. Outside the windows, dusk was gathering. Please, Mom, we got to stay for the eats, Lucy was begging. She was still riding high on her triumph. People had clapped for her. Even her mother had clapped and smiled, very nearly. Not for long. It's dark most. Mrs. Wilkins reached down to brush Lucy's hair out of her glowing face. Teacher must have heard, for she came over. Are you on foot, Mrs. Wilkins? Mrs. Wilkins nodded. We'll make sure you get a ride. Enjoy the party. It was as though on the 8th day God had said, let there be food. And there was food. Pumpkin and apple and squash and mince pies, plump puddings and jam tarts, gingerbread and little cakes with maple sugar frosting. And behold, it was very good. What do you call this? Jip kept asking Lucy as he bit into one new treat after another. She knew the names or invented them. It didn't matter. Jip ate everything. He couldn't decide which he favored most, so he had to go back and have another tart to see if he indeed preferred it to the muffin topped with currant jelly, or the iced tea cake, or the pumpkin pie. You're going to be sick, Mrs. Wilkins warned, but she didn't try to stop them from stuffing themselves. They were the last to leave. Teacher's gentleman friend put out the fire in the stove. No school tomorrow, while the rest of them took down the decorations and the candles and stored them in a big wooden box for next year. Jip got out the broom and began to sweep pine needles off the floor. No, thank you anyhow, Jip, Teacher said. Enough for tonight. It's late, and by the time the holiday is over, I'll have to sweep again. Just take these branches out to the wood pile for me, please, and then Mr. Stevens will give us all a ride home. She gave the gentleman one of her lovely smiles. Jip rushed outside with the greens. It was dark with only the faint glow of the lamp from inside the building. Willie had said sweetheart, but Jip had resisted the idea. But that smile? He hurried around to the woodshed. Hey, boy. Jip jumped. For a moment he was afraid, but then he recognized the shadow leaning against the building. It was the oldest Brackett. Addison, I thought you'd gone home with the rest. I've been meaning to tell you something private-like, but there's never a private time in school to talk. What do you mean, tell me something? There was a feller around town some months ago. Jip put his armload of greens down. He hoped Addison couldn't see how trembly he was. Well, for some reason he's mighty interested in you. He give me cash money to keep an eye on you. Yeah? Just letting you know, I got my eye on you, boy. Jip, teacher was calling from the doorway. I gotta go. Well, you be good now. I don't want to have no trouble doing my job here. I ain't going nowhere if that's what you mean. He hurried off around the building, his stupid heart beating faster than a chick's. It was only Addison Brackett, for mercy's sake. Is everything all right? Teacher asked. Fine, he said. Just fine. But the words came out like panting. So the stranger has asked Addison Brackett to keep an eye on Jip. Interesting. All right, that's the end of chapter 9.